And whilst Belinda's coming up, I want to introduce a young man who here you go, H is still a young man, very proud to call a friend of mine, but that friendship has come through the relationship that we had as coach and athlete. So his name is Hamish McDonald. If any of you followed Paralympic sport, Hamish was recognised for his achievements as an athlete with an Order of Australia medal back in the 90s. He was a bit like some of the officials here, was a ground setter in terms of his capacity for training, his desire to make good decisions which would affect his career. When we first met Hamish, he was based in Alice Springs, had a fantastic work ethic, was a runner, and in fact runs better than he walks, and I think he'd be the first to admit that, but he's got much more freedom running than he has walking. But he's incredibly strong, and in fact, as a schoolboy, won 2 bench press championships because his legs weren't as required as much as his arms in bench press, and won 2 schoolboy bench press championships. Came to the AIS because I was very impressed with his, when I was head coach there, with his approach to his way he went about his sport. And very quickly his story was, H gave him a call one afternoon, got a position at the AIS if you're interested in a scholarship. He said, thanks for the offer, but I've got all my boxes packed up and I'm heading from Alice Springs to Darwin tomorrow to start a psychology degree. I said, no hurry, but I just need to know by tomorrow. 3 hours later, I got a phone call. I'm coming to Canberra. And he's been there ever since and has now been employed with the Sports Commission, but, a Paralympic gold medalist, world record holder, and has done some extraordinary things. But the most interesting thing I think he's done, he's turned up by accident to Muhammad Ali's birthday party one year. So that's a story for after we're finished. But what I'm interested from both of you is you are both from regional areas of Australia. And this is particularly relevant to this audience, is the challenge we have. Belinda, clearly driven to, you've paved your own path because you've gone, this is what I want to do, and you've gone for it. And Hamish, at one stage, water boy for the local football team. Very big different journey to the one you ended up taking where you became an athlete and now you are, you've been working in the sports industry for a lot of years now. So I might start with you, H, if we can get you to talk about the officiating in the regional areas and just the challenges out there of trying to get officials to oversee sport from that perspective in those communities.
Yeah, so thanks, Nani. Thanks for the introduction too. Sorry, it would have put me to sleep. It was a bit long. So I grew up in Alice Springs, and my story's not dissimilar to Claire's in that I was part of a big family, 3 brothers, and sport was a fairly consistent part of the weekend fabric, whether it be summer or winter. And I basically shadowed my older brother through various forms of various different football codes. They played all sorts of football in Alice, most famously AFL. There's lots of high-profile AFL players, but my brother was built a little bit like me, so quite short in stature, not really built for AFL, so he pursued the 2 rugby codes, and they played one version of rugby league in winter, and the other version rugby union in summer. So my brother was lucky enough to play footy all year of one sort or another. And I started my first exposure to sport was as an official in one way or another, actually at AFL doing timekeeping and interchange management. But I followed my brother when he swapped codes, and what was really interesting for me is that the typical behaviour of a local sporting environment is that at post-match or post-game, everyone has a beer together, and even despite some adversaries on the field of play, oftentimes both clubs post-match, and often it's quite late in the evening and sometimes early morning, but the 2 clubs still get together and celebrate or commiserate or have a conversation about the game. But you never saw officials there. And I remember, I was reflecting when Nani sort of spoke about what we might chat about up here. There was one official, his name was Peter Carr, and I remember he was a rugby league official, and he would officiate up to 3 first grade. Now the standard of, there's no one here from Alice Springs, but the standard of first grade rugby league in Alice Springs wasn't great, but that would have made the officiating job harder, I would have thought, but also his capacity to turn up every week, cop the abuse that was dished out quite readily, but never get invited to be part of the post-game celebration or the post-game conversation. I think that's, in terms of changing the way officials are considered, thought about, and changing the way people's attitude towards officials at a local level. I think that's one way in particular that, at a really grassroots, local kind of level, that sport can change its behaviour. Now, it's probably not going to happen overnight. and it's probably going to be a bit ugly and awkward, particularly when there's controversial decisions made by officials doing their job. But I think there's an opportunity for the communities to get behind officials in a real grassroots, practical way by engaging them in the traditional post-event or post-match festivities and commiserations that go on. So it's going to take some emotional energy from everyone concerned, particularly the officials, if they've had a busy weekend like this guy Peter Carr might have done on most winter weekends in Alice. But I think that's a real opportunity for local sport to notwithstanding all the conversations already had this evening about lack of priority and lack of resourcing even at a national level, I think some behaviour change at a local level where officials take it upon themselves, and there's probably going to take some leadership from within this room for people to make the choice to go and have a beer and a conversation with the same group of players or group of participants that you might have had some tough conversations with only hours earlier.
So H, just before we flick to Belinda, I'm also keen, particularly in those community areas that are regional, the roles that people sometimes confuse. You mentioned to me earlier that the fact that each game's made up of officials and athletes and coaches, but also spectators. And I know you've got some thoughts around, crossing over the roles that people have to play on during each and every game.
Yeah, so there's no doubt, and people have discussed this at length already this evening, but there's no doubt for sport to be successful, it takes 4 elements. It takes coaches, athletes, officials, and observers, audiences, crowds, whatever you want to call them. In my sport in the sport that I coach, track and field, a performance by a thrower is completely irrelevant unless there's an official there. And so it's important for everybody to understand how that little microcosm or very important microcosm works, and it's also important for people to understand the various roles that they have in making that work. And I think there's implicit permission given for bad behaviour towards officials when athletes and coaches display bad behaviour. So as soon as there's an adversarial relationship between an athlete and a coach in any situation, whether it be elite high performance sport or local sport, then that automatically has an impact on the culture of the whole event and the culture of the whole situation. So it's really, really important for role boundaries to be clear for all parties, not just... oftentimes there's lots of time and energy spent on role boundaries for officials and role boundaries for coaches, but I think there needs to be a wider conversation with all 4 elements about the role boundaries and the roles of everybody in making that a success, and it'll help change the conversation that we currently have about officiating. So I think there's a real opportunity there and even in forums such as this, we've had some interaction with sort of 3 parts of the 4-part story in terms of coaches, athletes, officials, and the audience. But it would be interesting to see how we could collectively change the conversation around the position of officials in all of sport when we get all 4 parties and all 4 elements having the conversation repeatedly and continually.
So Belinda, I'd like to flick to you because you mentioned so passionately the enjoyment of the journey that you've taken. Clearly you are self-motivated, self-driven, but sometimes it's younger athletes and sometimes it's parents of children and sometimes it's people who've got more time on their hands that get involved in officiating. What can we do at a regional level to encourage that level of enjoyment, almost from the time you step into a field, pick up a whistle, grab a rule book or whatever it is you need to do to officiate that sport? I was really keen to hear more about what we could do for that enjoyment element.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think, as you said, a lot of that can be self-driven, but not everybody is necessarily in that same space. So I think that's where mentors, coaches, associations have such an important role to play. There's ways to make it enjoyable, and I think sometimes we focus so much, as I said before, on the negatives and things that we need to fix or things we need to change. Constantly we're always reviewing games and our positions in that way, that sometimes we forget about the positive things. And I think reinforcing those positive things can, I suppose, remind people of the enjoyment of why they do things. And there's simple things like making training enjoyable, engaging with each other and even, attending other people's games and being a support. There's ways to, I suppose, encourage that enjoyment factor from within the association, I believe.
Leads nicely to the enjoyment element, but also you mentioned very strongly and firmly about mentoring. And you mentioned your sister being a mentor. I'd like both of you to tackle this, and perhaps you, Belinda, first. But the mentors that you've had throughout, what is the consistent, enjoyable part of the mentoring that you've had?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, a big part for me is not just, having people from within the sport. I think it's important to have, a person that you can, a sounding board and a person you can bounce things off that is not necessarily involved heavily in what you're doing. So for me, that was my sister. And if I had appointments that didn't go my way, or, games that I didn't get that I'd hoped to get, or, setbacks, mistakes that I'd made in games, that kind of thing, quite often after speaking to, I suppose, mentors and coaches within the sport, I'd often speak to her as well. And I think it just gives you a different perspective on things, and it's not always just game focused or officiating focused. Sometimes you need people to put things into perspective for you and give you that bigger picture. And I think that's something that she's done really well for me, and she knows the role she plays for me in that sense. And I think she's always been happy to be a sounding board. And sometimes you just need to vent. Sometimes you need someone to talk to. I think that's important as well.
I was asked with H, should the mentoring relationship be driven? And we hear this a lot about the mentee. I wonder sometimes, though, whether a good mentor will look at someone and just that simple question of, you okay? Can initiate a discussion, where sometimes you need that inner strength to go, I'll be fine. Whereas somebody who knows you really well might go, actually, we need a coffee. H?
Yeah, I think as my role has changed in the sport of athletics, I think it's been really clear that you need contact and you need support when in your official role as a coach or an athlete. But then to have that external sounding board, that someone who knows you intimately, or someone who's known you for a long time, can see things that maybe other people don't see, and they can just reach out and have a chat. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to start from a particular place. It's just a genuine conversation about how they're going. Sometimes there isn't the time to reflect on who the best person for that role might be, and sometimes we default to someone inside the tent or inside the circle, and sometimes they're not always the best person, because we all come, if you're talking to the same people, we come from a place with a similar lens. It's all a sport lens, so to find someone without a sport lens to come and talk to you about other stuff, it'd be oftentimes it's surprising how relatable that is back to the situation that you might have found yourself in relation to the sport, whether it's as a role as an official or a coach or an athlete or any other.
Now, Hamish, I also know that you've had some fairly difficult international experiences, at World Championship level. I can remember where officials weren't on the same page as what we'd certainly understood the rule book to be, and we were pretty firm on, as his coach and as athlete, we understood what the rule book was, but there was times in the pathway of Paralympic sport where the career wasn't the pathway or the rule book wasn't as clear to the officials. How much did that affect your psyche as an athlete?
Yeah, I think on reflection, I think some of my behaviour, I can highlight one particular event, the 1998 World Championships, Nutty. I was horrible. I was horrible because I was intensely passionate about the work that we'd put in and that we were failing. And we felt at the time that we were failing for reasons that were outside of our control. Upon reflection, and some time later, 20 years later, there's definitely, I spoke earlier about how important it was for athletes and coaches to set the standard of behaviour that they expect from everyone else involved in the event, and that's a personal circumstance where, on reflection, I didn't do that. And certainly in my role, my emerging role as a coach, that's something I'm really conscious of. So the part I play in ensuring that sort of lack of understanding or lack of communication never occurs again is that it's been mentioned by a couple of people already, but you have to develop long-term relationships with officials as coaches and athletes, and they have to be meaningful, they have to be transparent, and they have to be effective. And I think as a coach, that's something that I've taken on as a key part of my role. And so in an international event, these meetings can sometimes be, excuse the French, but boring as batshit. But there's a technical meeting before most international events, and it's when all the officials get together and discuss rule changes or implementations of particular rules or how they'll be interpreted. And there's some nuances within the Paralympic sphere which are unique, and so sometimes the officials don't get exposure to those nuances all that often. So it's really crucial as a coach that you're part of that conversation. You don't have to say much, but you have to be clear about what's being said and understand how the rule will be interpreted, because that gives you an opportunity to manage the situation from that point on. And I think that's certainly a moment of learning from my career, and it's something that I'm fairly adamant that I implement as a coach.
Thanks, H. Ash, from the floor, what do we have?
So we did have a question for H, but you, as always, just answered it. But that's great. So this one's for Belinda. What advice would you give to a local association that wanted more female officials in their ranks?
Believe it or not, I get asked this question a lot. And my answer, it's a difficult one to answer, because I've always been strong about just encouraging officials in general. So I don't necessarily think that we need to target females or males specifically. And I think part of that is me being so strong on just people wanting to officiate because they enjoy it. And I think necessarily targeting a gender-specific group, you may not get the right people. So I think it's important, if you can identify females that, maybe have some potential, or, that they're playing the game and might potentially want to cross over and officiate, those kind of things. I think that's, a great initiative. But I think specifically targeting a gender in a sport is not something that I necessarily condone. But I was speaking with Clarkie before, and one of the things that, I've always said is, I don't feel like I need to go and necessarily recruit females to be involved as referees in rugby league, but if them seeing me on an NRL game on a Thursday or Friday night encourages them to pick up a whistle and go and take it up, then I feel like I've done my job just by doing my job, if that makes sense. So I think, we have a role to play, female officials in any sport have a role to play in encouraging, other females and other junior officials to get involved, simply by setting a good standard, setting a good example, being professional at what we do, and, hopefully that they can see that there's a pathway and opportunity for them to get involved that way.
Right, we've got one more, and it came up in the previous panel, but I'll throw it to you, Belinda, again. Being rugby league official, what impact has technology and TV referees had on the game, and how does that influence sort of officiating at the grassroots level?
This might have been a good one for Clarkie, since he was a video referee. Oh, well, I guess we all know that, technology plays a big part in rugby league these days, most definitely. Obviously, with the introduction of the bunker in the last couple of years, people love to hate the bunker, of course. But for us as on-field officials, it's crucial. And why I say it's crucial is, the change in the way the game is presented on TV. So what we see is one angle on the field. What however many cameras there are around the stadium sees could be something completely different. So often people say to me, people come up to me all the time and complain and say, why do the referees always go to the bunker all the time? Why don't they just make decisions? I don't know how many times I get asked that question. And my answer to them is, we always want to come to the right decision. Fans always want the correct decision in the game. They always say we want our team to have the right decision. So part of that is the technology that has now developed in our game, with the amount of camera angles and I guess the way the game is made for TV these days. That's why the invention of the bunker has come into play, because we're seeing the game in a different way now. And as officials, we have the technology there, and, we need to continue to use it. So I understand the frustration sometimes of people and the sort of stop-start nature that can create with a game. But, as officials, we understand that if we've got the technology and the way that the game is played on TV these days, that we need to use it.
Thank you, Belinda. And thank you, Hamish. I'm going to ask you now to take your seats, but can you please thank both our guests here?